Before we begin, I'd like to make one recommendation to everyone listening. If this is your first time listening to Dark Margins, I'd encourage you to start with episode 1 and experience the series in order. Each episode builds on the last, and together they create a psychological framework for understanding revenge, how it begins, how it grows, and ultimately what it costs. Today's episode is the culmination of that journey. And yes, you can absolutely listen to it on its own, but you'll gain a much deeper appreciation for what we're exploring if you've walked the path with us from the beginning. Now, with that said, let's begin. What if I told you prison wasn't the hardest thing Nelson Mandela had to escape? The cell he lived in for 27 years had walls. The second prison didn't. Today, we talk about Nelson Mandela, and this episode is about something that is, in its own way, harder to look at than anything we've covered in 8 episodes of revenge, obsession, and destruction. It's about forgiveness. And I want to be honest with you right now before we take a single step further. Forgiveness is harder than revenge. Every time. Without exception. Revenge gives you something to do with the pain. It gives you a target, a plan, a direction to move in. It makes the wound feel like it has purpose. Forgiveness asks you to feel the pain completely with no target, no plan, no direction. And then forgiveness chooses something different anyway. And like I said at the beginning, every person we've covered on this channel chose revenge. Edmond Dantès, Medea, Amy Doon, the House of Atreus, Atreus himself, Emily Grierson, Captain Ahab, Miss Havisham. 8 different people, 8 different wounds, 8 different versions of the same fundamental choice. But today, we cover someone who made a different choice. Not because the wound was smaller, not because the grievance was less legitimate, and not because he lacked the means or the anger or the reason, but because he understood something forged over 27 years in a prison cell that none of the people we've covered before him ever fully grasped. And that's that what you do with your wound defines you more completely than the wound itself. And once again, this is Nelson Mandela. It's drawn from his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, published in 1994, and from the historical record of one of the most extraordinary lives of the 20th century. And the greatest part about this episode is it's about what happens inside a human being when everything that should produce rage produces something else instead. Now, before we talk about what prison did to Nelson Mandela, we need to talk about who Nelson Mandela was before it. Because like every person we've covered on this channel, the wound came first, and understanding the man before the wound is how we understand everything that follows. Now, if you've never heard Nelson Mandela's full name, you're going to get a kick out of this, and I absolutely love it. It has a beautiful meaning, but it's just fun to say, and Nelson Mandela's full name is Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, or even pronounced more closely in the tribe of his people would be Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. It means pulling the branch of a tree. That's Rolihlahla. And he was born in 1918 in the village of Mvezo in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. His father is the chief of the Tembu people, and his name Rolihlahla once again means literally in Xhosa, pulling the branch of a tree. Now, on his first day of school, his teacher gives him the English name Nelson. It was a common practice at the time that Mandela later reflected on with this kind of quiet irony. Now, Nelson's not born into deprivation. He's born into tradition, into a community with structure and history and identity. He's born into a family that carries responsibility and expectation. And from the very beginning, Mandela is someone who feels the weight of responsibility acutely. He studies law. He becomes one of the first black lawyers in South Africa. He opens a law firm in Johannesburg with one of his friends, Oliver Tambo. And together those two form the first black law firm in the country. And every day Nelson Mandela is in that law firm, he sees what the system does to the people he's trying to serve. South Africa in the 1940s and 50s is operating under apartheid. Apartheid's a system of institutionalized racial segregation that's so complete and so deliberately constructed and embedded in every layer of daily life that it's almost impossible to describe from the outside. You got to think about this for a minute. Not just separate schools or separate neighborhoods, but separate benches, separate entrances, separate buses, separate beaches, separate ambulances, separate hospitals, separate cemeteries. It was a system that classified human beings by race and then arranged every aspect of society to reflect that classification from birth to death and everywhere in between. Mandela lives inside this system. He practices law inside this system. And he raises a family inside this system. And he watches with the particular clarity of a trained legal mind exactly how the system sustains itself and what it costs the people it was designed to crush. And at that point, he makes a choice. He joins the African National Congress. He becomes one of its most prominent voices. He organizes, he campaigns, he speaks, he leads. And then, when it becomes clear that peaceful protest is being met with increased violence from the state, he makes another choice. He helps found the armed wing of the ANC, Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation. Not because he abandoned the principle of peaceful resistance, but because he concluded after years of watching peaceful protest answered with bullets and batons that the people he was fighting for deserved someone willing to fight back. And that fighting back leads him to the Rivonia trial. It's 1964. Mandela's arrested, tried, convicted of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. At his sentencing in the Rivonia trial, he delivers a statement from the dock that, this is powerful, listen to this right here. He closes it with these words: "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It's an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I'm prepared to die." And after that statement, he's sentenced to life imprisonment. He's 45 years old, and he walks into Robben Island prison not knowing if he'll ever walk out. Now, Robben Island prison sits in Table Bay off the coast of Cape Town. It's 7 kilometers from the mainland, close enough that on a clear day you can see the mountains of Cape Town from the island shores. And it's just close enough for Nelson to see freedom, but far enough away that it means nothing. Mandela's cell is 8 feet by 7 feet. And if you take a moment to think about that, 8 by 7, smaller than most bathrooms, it's smaller than most walk-in closets. There's a mat on the floor, a bucket, a small window with a view of the prison yard. For the first 13 years, he's allowed one visitor every 6 months. 30 minutes, separated by glass, no physical contact. For years, his letters are censored so heavily that entire paragraphs arrive as black lines. Some pages arrive with nothing readable at all. He's classified as the lowest prisoner grade, D group, a classification that comes with the fewest privileges, the hardest labor, the most restrictions. Every morning, prisoners are taken to a limestone quarry. They break rocks by hand in the African sun. The lime dust so caustic that it permanently damages Mandela's eyesight, a condition he carries for the rest of his life. That's dehumanizing as it is, but one of the psychological ways to dehumanize someone is to take away their name. Instead, give them a number. The guards address him not by name, but by number, and that's 466/64. It means prisoner 466 of 1964. And he stays there for 27 years. Not 27 years of comfortable imprisonment with books and visitors and the quiet dignity of a man who knows his story will be told eventually, but 27 years of hard labor, restricted contact, deliberate dehumanization, and the daily grinding systematic message that you're not a person, you're a number. And here's the question we ask in every episode, and of course it's at the psychological center of this entire episode too, and what does that do to a person? What does 27 years of dehumanization do to the anger that was already there? Legitimate, documented, historically verified anger at a system that had classified him as less than human since before he could vote. And here's what most people would expect. That it hardens, that it compounds, that 27 years of injustice piled on top of the original injustice creates something that comes out of that prison like a weapon, pointed, sharp, and looking for a target. And Mandela, in The Long Walk of Freedom, is honest about the fact that the anger was there. He doesn't pretend it wasn't. He doesn't offer a sanitized version of his experience that erases the human reality of what it feels like to have your freedom taken, your name replaced with a number, and your family kept from you. And your eyes damaged by forced labor. I mean, Mandela felt it every single day. But here's what Robben Island also gave him, and this is the part that most people don't talk about. And it gave him time. And 27 years is a long time to think. It's a long time to read. It's a long time to talk to other men imprisoned alongside him. And these men who were alongside him became some of the most important political and intellectual figures in South African history. Take, for instance, Walter Sisulu. And apart from being one of Mandela's closest friends and mentors, he was also a founding member of the ANC Youth League. He was also sentenced at the Rivonia trial alongside Mandela and served 26 years on Robben Island. Walter became one of the most respected elder statesmen in post-apartheid South Africa. On top of Walter, you also have Govan Mbeki. He was the father of Thabo Mbeki, who later became president of South Africa after Mandela. Those weren't the only three at the Rivonia trials. You also had Ahmad Kathrada, Oliver Tambo. Then you had Robert Sobukwe. He was the leader of the Pan-Africanist Congress. He was imprisoned on Robben Island under a special clause of law that allowed the government to keep him detained indefinitely beyond his sentence. It was a clause Parliament renewed specifically for him every year. He was kept in complete isolation from other prisoners. But he also became one of the most intellectually significant figures of the anti-apartheid movement. Then you have Steve Biko. He wasn't imprisoned on Robben Island, but he is one of the most important figures of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. He was arrested in 1977 and died in police custody from injuries sustained during interrogation. His death became one of the defining moments of the international awareness about apartheid's brutality. His story is the subject of the film titled Cry Freedom. The apartheid regime was a brutal way to silence voices. But we'll get back to Mandela. Mandela has spent a long time studying the system that imprisoned him. He spent a long time understanding it, not just feeling it. And Mandela, with a mind of a trained lawyer and the patience of a man who had no choice but to be patient, used every one of those years. So he began to study Afrikaans. It was the language of his captors, and he didn't do it to accommodate them. He did it to understand them, to be able to speak to them in their own language and to see behind the ideology into the human being underneath. He also took that time to read everything he could access, and with that knowledge, he debated, he taught, he mentored young prisoners. He maintained his dignity with such consistency and such quiet force that eventually, even some of the prison guards began to treat him differently. And not because the system changed, but because he refused to let the system define him. And somewhere in those 27 years, in that 8x7 cell, breaking limestone in the South African sun, receiving letters with entire paragraphs blacked out, Mandela arrived at something. And it wasn't easy, it wasn't quickly, it definitely had its cost, but he arrived at it. He arrived at an understanding of what forgiveness actually is. And what it is not what most people think it is. And we need to stop here for a moment before we go further, because the word forgiveness gets used in ways that I think do it a serious disservice. And before we talk about what Mandela did, I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. Forgiveness is not, and I want to be very clear about this, forgiveness is not saying that what was done to you was acceptable. It's not pretending the wound didn't happen. It's not excusing the people who hurt you, and it's not reconciliation, which is a separate thing that may or may not follow forgiveness depending on the circumstances. But above all, I would say that forgiveness is the antithesis of weakness. But enough about what forgiveness isn't. Let's talk about what forgiveness is. And here's what the psychological research actually tells us what it is. And here's a book by Enright and Fitzgibbons. It's titled Helping Clients Forgive, an empirical guide for resolving anger and restoring hope. Enright, you see, is widely considered the pioneer of forgiveness research in modern psychology. And so these two say in the book, they say, forgiveness is a decision made by the person who is wronged for the benefit of the person who is wronged to release the grip that the wound has on their present and their future. Now let's read the beginning again. Made by the person who was wronged for the benefit of the person who was wronged. Not for the benefit of the person who caused the harm, and not as a gift to the people who hurt you, or the erasure of what happened or an endorsement of what was done. But forgiveness, true forgiveness, the kind Mandela arrived at over 27 years, is the decision that the wound's not going to be the thing that runs your life anymore. That the person who put you in that cell doesn't get to live in your head rent-free for the rest of your existence. That you're going to reclaim the territory of your own future from the people who tried to take it. There's a Dr. Fred Luskin at Stanford University. He's done some of the most rigorous research on forgiveness in modern psychology, and he describes it this way. Forgiveness is the peace you learn to feel when you allow the story of what happened to you to become the story of what you survived, rather than the story of what was done to you. The story of what you survived, rather than the story of what was done to you. Now, to put that in perspective and do a quick recap of the episodes previous, Edmond Dantès, his story was always the story of what was done to him. Every movie made for 13 years was the story of what was done to him. Medea, the story of what Jason did, defined every choice she made until the fire. Ahab, the whale taking his leg, was the story of what was done to him so completely that it replaced every other story he had. And Miss Havisham, well, she stopped the clocks at the moment of the wound and lived in that story of what was done to her every morning for decades. But Mandela, in a prison cell smaller than most bathrooms, breaking limestone with his bare hands, he chose a different story. And as I said earlier, it didn't come immediately, and I know it wasn't easy. And it wasn't without the full weight of everything that was being done to him, pressing down on that choice every single day, but still, he chose it. And he chose it again the next day. And the day after that, 27 years of choosing that forgiveness is not weakness, that it's actually the hardest thing a human being can do. And like I said, it was 27 years. It led to the day, February 11th, 1990. Nelson Mandela walks out of Victor Verster prison. He'd been transferred from Robben Island years earlier, but It was still a 27-year imprisonment. He's 71 years old now. He was 45 when he went in, but 71 now. He's missed his children growing up. He's missed funerals and weddings and the ordinary accumulation of life lived freely. His eyesight's been permanently damaged. His body carries the cost of 27 years of hard labor and insufficient nutrition. And he walks out of that gate hand in hand with his then-wife Winnie, his fist raised into a world that had been waiting for him. The images of that walk are some of the most recognizable in 20th century history. The cameras, the crowds, the moment that represented for millions of people around the world. It was something they'd been holding their breath for. And here's what Mandela says about that walk and a long walk to freedom. He says that as he walked toward the gate, he felt, it wasn't triumph, and it wasn't vindication, and it wasn't the satisfaction of a man whose enemies are about to face consequences. But instead, he felt a profound sense of responsibility. He writes that he knew in that moment that if he projected hatred and bitterness, if he came through that gate as a weapon that 27 years of injustice might reasonably have forged him into, that 27 years would have been lost, and he would have lost. Not politically and not strategically, but he would have lost himself. And he had just spent 27 years refusing to lose himself. And so he definitely wasn't going to do it at the gate. Mandela also says something in Long Walk to Freedom that I think it's just awesome. It's a single sentence. It's great. Mandela writes, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. If I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." To everyone listening, the gate wasn't the prison. The bitterness was the prison. And Mandela, with 27 years of practice, knew exactly how to leave it behind. Let's connect that to something we've talked about on this channel before. As Havisham stopped clocks, the prison she built inside her own house, that was the same thing Mandela's describing. The physical imprisonment ended the day he walked through the gate. The psychological imprisonment, the one built from bitterness and the story of what was done to you, that one doesn't end automatically. You have to choose to leave it behind. And you have to choose that every single day. Mandela made that choice every single day. So here's the question that this episode's been building towards since the first episode of Dark Margins. This is our 9th episode, and we've spent 9 episodes asking in different ways through different stories across different centuries and continents and cultures, what does a person do when they're genuinely wronged? And looking episode after episode, we've seen 8 different answers so far. All of them involve some form of harm directed outward. And all of the episodes showed that the cost the person inside the cycle paid was far more than the cost the people the cycle was aimed at paid. And so, now we get a 9th answer. And it comes from a man whose grievance wasn't personal. It wasn't the betrayal of a friend or the abandonment of a lover. It wasn't a rival stealing what was his. His grievance was systematic, institutional, and it was backed by the full force of a government and a legal system and a military and an entire social architecture designed to dehumanize him and everyone who looked like him. And still, Mandela chose forgiveness. Now, here's something to be careful about, because it would be very easy at this point to turn Mandela into a saint, to make him into something so extraordinary and so beyond ordinary human experience that his choice feels inspiring but not necessarily applicable. And that would be a disservice to what he actually did. Mandela's not a saint, well, not in the traditional sense. He's a man. He's a man who felt anger, who felt bitterness, who felt the specific grinding and daily injustice of having his name replaced with a number and his freedom taken by people who had no right to take it. He was also a man who made mistakes in his personal life, in his political judgments, and the choices he made under circumstances most of us can barely imagine. And he writes about those mistakes honestly in A Long Walk to Freedom. He doesn't offer himself as a model of perfection. He offers himself as a model of choice, a specific, repeatable, daily choice. And using that, we'll dive into psychology one more time. And it comes from Dr. Everett Worthington, one of the leading researchers on forgiveness psychology, identifies what he calls the REACH model of forgiveness. Recall the hurt, don't minimize it, don't pretend it didn't happen, face it completely. Empathize, try to understand the humanity of the person who caused the harm without executing what they did. Altruistic gift, recognize that forgiveness is something you give yourself, not something you owe the person who hurt you. Commit. Make the decision and name it, even before the feeling fully follows the choice. And hold on. Because the feeling will fluctuate. The decision has to be stronger than the feeling on the days when the feeling pulls back toward the wound. Recall, empathize, altruistic gift, commit, hold on. Now think about Mandela's 27 years through that framework. He recalled, he never pretended that what was done to him was acceptable. Long Walk to Freedom is not a sanitized account. It's a clear-eyed documentation of injustice. He empathized, he learned Afrikaans, he studied the people who imprisoned him, he looked for the human being behind the ideology. He gave himself the altruistic gift. He chose, as he wrote, to leave the bitterness behind at the gate. And he didn't do that for the people who imprisoned him, he did that for himself. He committed. Publicity, consistency at every opportunity. And of course, he held on. For the rest of his life, through enormous provocation, through circumstances that would have tested the choice daily. That's not necessarily sainthood. That's the REACH model applied at the most extreme possible scale. And here's what it tells us about ourselves. If the framework that Mandela used intuitively over decades without the benefit of a psychology textbook is the same framework that modern research has identified as the mechanism of genuine forgiveness, then the choice he made is not beyond us. It's just harder than we usually want it to be, and it takes longer than we usually want it to take. And because of that, unfortunately, most of us, and I mean most of us, give up before we get to the gate. Now, before we end, let's go back through Dark Margins one more time. Edmond Dantès was wronged by 3 men who made a deliberate choice to destroy him. He spent 13 years in prison unjustly and came out with a plan. His revenge was surgical, proportional, and by the standards of the genre, deeply satisfying. And at the end, he felt doubt. He wondered if he'd gone too far. His humanity survived, but the cycle of harm continued. Medea was wronged by a man she had sacrificed everything for. Her revenge destroyed her enemies and herself simultaneously. She crossed the line from justice into something that had no name on the other side of it. Amy Doon was wronged, genuinely, by a husband who checked out of a marriage while she maintained it alone. Her response was so cold and so total that it trapped her inside it permanently. That the plan always needed a new target. The House of Atreus cycled for generations until a goddess physically intervened. Atreus went so far past revenge that the Greek gods said the sun turned away in horror. Emily Grierson never understood that what she did had a name, Ahab took a ship full of men to the bottom of the ocean chasing something that never knew he existed. As Havisham stopped every clock and built a child into a weapon, and found that crack of forgiveness a little too late at the cost of everything. Now, Mandela was wronged more institutionally than any person Dark Margins has examined. Who had more reason to come out of that prison as a weapon than Edmond Dantès or Medea or Amy Doon or any of them? Who had the legitimacy, the moral authority, the historical justification, and, frankly, the popular support to aim everything he had at the people who took 27 years from him? And who walked out of that gate with his fist raised and chose something harder? The psychological question I want to leave you with isn't, was Mandela right? And it wasn't, should everyone choose forgiveness in every circumstance? I believe that the healthy way, but we all know that those questions come with complicated answers that depend on circumstances I'm not qualified to adjudicate. So, the question I want to leave you with is simpler and more personal. What is your wound costing you? Not the person who caused it, not the system that allowed it, not the people who watched and said nothing. What is it costing you? What is it costing you every day you maintain the cycle, every morning you wake up in the worst moment of your life, or every hour you spend in the prison that the wound built inside you to stay there? Because here's what the 9th episode of Dark Margins has proven. And it's proven it through 8 stories of revenge and only 1 story of something else entirely. The wound is real, the grievance is legitimate, and the cycle's always more expensive than the original injury. Edmond Dantès spent 13 years in a prison for a crime he didn't commit, and he spent the next decade in a prison he built himself. Miss Havisham spent one morning being defrauded by a man who targeted her, and then spent decades in a house she sealed herself into. Ahab lost his leg to a whale that had no malice, and he and his crew lost everything else by choice. The original wound is something that happened to you, but the cycle is something you choose. And Mandela, over 27 years in an 8x7 cell, figured out how to choose differently. And that's the most important thing Dark Margins has ever said. That there's hope. So here's what I want to leave you with today. We started this series with Edmond Dantès. We've talked about it already in this episode, and if you haven't gone through the episodes in order, I always recommend that you do. We started with Edmond Dantès, the Count of Monte Cristo. And of course, he was a man who was buried alive and spent 13 years engineering this satisfying revenge, and most of us cheered for him. I know, because I understand why. Because the wound was real, and the justice was proportional, and the patience was extraordinary, and there's something deeply human about watching someone who was buried alive rise up and dismantle the people who did it. And we moved through 8 stories, 8 wounds, 8 choices, each one darker than the last in its own specific way. And all of that has led us here. And it was at a man whose wound was just as big, and whose choice was the hardest one available. Let's get back to Dr. Fred Luskin at Stanford's Forgiveness Project. He tells us what the research tells us, and I want to cite this specifically because Dark Margins is building a framework here that deserves to be grounded in real science. And the science shows that people who practice forgiveness, genuine forgiveness, not minimization, not pretending, they show measurable reductions in stress hormones, blood pressure, and depression symptoms. Dr. Everett Worthington's research found that unforgiveness, the sustained maintenance of a grievance, activates the same stress response pathways as the original trauma, meaning the person who won't forgive is psychologically re-experiencing the original wound every time they maintain the cycle. We talked about this in the Miss Havisham episode. Sustained revenge re-traumatizes the person inside the cycle. This is something Mandela understood, and he didn't get it from a textbook, but from actually living 27 years inside the choice and feeling what it cost him when he moved toward bitterness and what it gave him when he moved away from it. Mandela writes in A Long Walk to Freedom that the prison, as terrible as it was, gave him something he couldn't have gotten anywhere else. It gave him time to become who he needed to be. Not who the wound wanted him to be, and not who the system that imprisoned him expected him to be, and not who revenge would have made him to be, but who he needed to be. And all of this encourages me to say something to anyone listening to this today who's carrying a wound. Not a wound the size of 27 years in a prison cell. Most of us will never face anything close to that. But a wound, a real one, the kind that stopped clocks somewhere. The kind that has a whale you've been chasing. The kind that a house you built around the worst morning of your life and moved into permanently. Mandela's choice is not beyond you. It's not reserved for extraordinary people with extraordinary capacity for grace. It's just a decision. And that decision's made one day at a time. It's also made imperfectly because Mandela made it imperfectly too. It's made slowly because Mandela also slowly made it. And it's made at a cost. And it also costs Mandela something real every single day. But it was still a decision that was made. The prison forged the choice, and the choice set him free. Once again, it's about hope. And that hope is what this series has been building toward. It's been 9 episodes, 9 different wounds, 9 different choices. And finally, it's the one episode, the one wound, the one choice that shows us the way all the way out. Long Walk to Freedom is one of the most important books written in the 20th century. It's not a short read, but I do want to tell you it reads the way Mandela lived, with patience, clarity, and particular dignity. That dignity was of a man who decided a long time ago exactly what he was going to be. You can start with the chapters on Robben Island, and make sure you also read the chapter on the walk out of Victor Verster prison. Those chapters together are this entire episode in about 60 pages. And as always, I'll link them in the description. And now we've spent 9 episodes on this channel examining what human beings do when they're wounded. We've seen revenge that satisfies, revenge that destroys, revenge that traps, revenge that cycles, revenge that becomes evil, revenge that was never really revenge, revenge that becomes a religion, and revenge that becomes a prison. And now, a choice that breaks the cycle entirely. We could call it revenge that destroys itself and becomes forgiveness. Next time, we go somewhere unexpected. We stay with the theme of the cycle breaking, but we go to a story where the person who breaks it isn't the one who was wronged, but the one who did the wronging. It's a story what it cost the person who caused the harm and what it takes to face it. Subscribe because this is the one that's going to ask you something different than anything we've asked before. Not, what would you do if you were wronged, but what would you do if you were the one who did it? I'm Bobby Garrison, and this is Dark Margins. I'll see you in the next chapter.